pilot had reflexes fast enough to carry out the intercept at 26,000 feet per second. And even had his reflexes been fast enough, he could not have done the precise piloting required while being pummeled by this acceleration. As it was, Major Harry Lightfoot, fighter pilot, lay motionless in his acceleration couch. His face was distorted by the acceleration. His breathing was labored. Compressed air bladders in the legs of his G-suit alternately expanded and contracted, squeezing him like the obscene embrace of some giant snake as the G-suit tried to keep his blood from pooling in his legs. Without the G-suit, he would have blacked out, and eventually his brain would have been permanently damaged from the lack of blood to carry oxygen to it. A red light on the instrument panel blinked balefully at him as it measured out the oxygen he required. Other instruments on the panel informed him about the amount of cooling air flowing through his suit to keep his temperature within tolerable range, and the amount of moisture the dehumidifier had to carry away from him so that his suit didn't become a steam bath. He was surrounded by hundreds of pounds of equipment, which added nothing to the performance of the ship, which couldn't be counted as payload, which cut down on the speed and altitude the ship might have reached without them. Their sole purpose was to keep this magnificent, high-performance, self-steering machine from killing its load of fragile human flesh. At 128 seconds after launch, the acceleration suddenly dropped to 0. He breathed deeply again and swallowed repeatedly to get the salty taste out of his throat. His stomach was uneasy, but he wasn't space-sick. Had he been prone to space sickness, he would never have been accepted as a rocket interceptor pilot. Rocket interceptor pilots had to be capable of taking all the punishment their ships could dish out. He knew there would be 50 seconds of free fall before the rockets fired again. One solid fuel stage had imparted to the ship a velocity which would carry it to the altitude of the missile it was to intercept. A second solid fuel stage would match trajectories with the missile. Final corrections would be made with the liquid fuel rockets in the third stage. The third stage would then become a glider, which eventually would carry him back to Earth. Before the second stage was fired, however, the ship had to be orientated properly. The autopilot consulted its gyros, took some star sights, and asked the navigation computer some questions. The answers came back in seconds, an interval which was several hours shorter than a human pilot would have required. Using the answers, the autopilot started to swing the ship about, using small compressed gas jets for the purpose. Finally satisfied with the ship's orientation, the autopilot rested. It patiently awaited the moment, precisely calculated by the computer on the ground, when it would fire the second stage. Major Harry Lightfoot, fighter pilot, waited idly for the next move of his ship. He could only fume inwardly. This was no way for an Apache warrior to ride into battle. What would his grandfather think of a steed which directed itself into battle, and which could kill its rider, not by accident, but by its normal operation? He should be actively hunting for that missile, instead of lying here strapped into his couch so he wouldn't hurt himself while the ship did all the work. As for the missile, it was far to the north and slightly above the ship. Without purpose of its own, but obedient to the laws of Mr. Newton and the wishes of its makers, it came on inexorably. It was a sleek aluminium cylinder, glinting in the sunlight it had just recently entered. On one end was a rocket motor, now silent but still warm with the memory of flaming gas that had poured forth from it only minutes ago. On the other end was a sleek, aerodynamic shape, the product of thousands of hours of design work. It was designed to enter the atmosphere at meteoric speed, but without burning up. It was intended to survive the passage through the air and convey its contents intact to the ground. The contents might have been virulent bacteria or toxic gas, according to the intention of its makers. Among its brothers elsewhere in the sky this morning, there were such noxious loads. This one, however, was carrying the complex mechanism of a hydrogen bomb. Its destination was an American city, its object to replace that city with an expanding cloud of star-hot gas. Suddenly, the sleek cylinder disappeared in a puff of smoke, which quickly dissipated in the surrounding vacuum. What had been a precisely built rocket had been reduced by carefully placed charges of explosive to a collection of chunks of metal. Some were plates from the skin and fuel tanks, others were large lumps from the computer banks, gyro platform, fuel pumps, and other more massive components. This was not wanton destruction, however. It was more careful planning by the same brains which had devised the missile itself. To a radar set on the ground near the target, each fragment was indistinguishable from the nose cone carrying the warhead. In fact, since the fragments were separating only very slowly, they would never appear as distinct objects. By the time the cloud of decoys entered the atmosphere, its more than 24 members would appear to the finest radar available on the ground as a single echo 25 miles across. It would be a giant haystack in the sky, concealing the most deadly needle of all time. No ground-controlled intercept scheme had any hope of selecting the warhead from among that deceptive cloud and destroying it. The cloud of fragments possessed the same trajectory as the missile originally had. At the rate it was overtaking RI-276, it would soon pass the ship by. The autopilot of RI-276 had no intention of letting this happen, of course. At the correct instant, Stage 2 thundered into life, and Harry Lightfoot was again smashed back into his acceleration couch. Almost absent-mindedly, the ship continued to minister to his needs. Its attention was focused on its mission. After a while, the ground computer sent some instructions to the ship. The navigation computer converted these into a direction and pointed a radar antenna in that direction. The antenna sent forth a stream of questing pulses, which quickly returned, confirming the direction and distance to the oncoming cloud of missile fragments. A little while later, fuel pumps began to whine somewhere in the tail of the ship. Then the acceleration dropped to zero as the second stage thrust was terminated. There was a series of thumps as explosive bolts released the second stage. The whine of the pumps dropped in pitch as fuel gushed through them, and acceleration returned in a rush. The acceleration lasted for a few seconds, tapered off quickly, and ended. A light winked on in the instrument panel as the ship announced its mission was accomplished. Major Harry Lightfoot, fighter pilot, felt a glow of satisfaction as he saw the light come on. He might not have the reflexes fast enough to pilot the ship up here. He might not be able to survive the climb to intercept without the help of a lot of fancy equipment. But he was still necessary. He was still one step ahead of this complex robot which had carried him up here. It was his human judgment and his ability to react correctly in an unpredictable situation which was needed to locate the warhead from among the cluster of decoys and destroy it. This was a job no merely logical machine could do. When all was said and done, the only purpose for the existence of this magnificent machine was to put him where he was now, in the same trajectory as the missile and slightly behind it. Harry Lightfoot reached for a red-handled toggle switch at the top of the instrument panel, clicked it from auto to manual, and changed his status from passenger to pilot. He had little enough time to work. He could not follow the missile down into the atmosphere. His ship would burn up. He must begin his pull-out at no less than 200 miles altitude. That left him 183 seconds in which to locate and destroy the warhead. The screen in the center of his instrument panel could show a composite image of the space in front of his ship, based on data from a number of sensing elements and detectors. He switched on an infrared scanner. A collection of spots appeared on the screen, each spot indicating by its color the temperature of the object it represented. The infrared detector gave him no range information, of course, but if the autopilot had done its job well, the nearest fragment would be about 10 miles away. Thus, even if he set off the enemy warhead, he would be safe. At that range, the ship would not suffer any structural damage from the heat, and he could be down on the ground in a hospital before any radiation effects could become serious. He reflected quickly on the possible temperature range of the missile components. The missile had been launched from Central Asia at night in January. There was no reason to suppose that the warhead had been temperature-controlled during the pre-launch countdown. Thus, it probably was at ambient temperature of the launch site. If it had been fired in the open, that might be as low as -70°F. Had it been fired from a shelter, that might be as high as 70°F. To leave a safety margin, he decided to reject only those objects outside the range of plus or minus 100°F. There were 2 fragments at 500 degrees. He rejected these as probable fragments of the engine. 6 more exhibited a temperature of nearly minus 320°F. These probably came from the liquid oxygen tanks. They could be rejected. That eliminated 8 of the objects on the screen. He had 19 to go. It would be a lot slower for the rest, too. He switched on a radar transmitter. The screen blanked out almost completely. The missile had included a microwave transmitter to act as a jammer. It must have been triggered on by his approach. It obviously hadn't been operating while the ship was maneuvering into position. Had it been transmitting then, the autopilot would simply have homed on it. He switched the radar to a different frequency. That didn't work. The screen was still blank, indicating that the jammer was sweeping in frequency. He next tried to synchronize the radar pulses with the jammer in order to be looking when it was quiet. The enemy, anticipating him, had given the jammer a variable pulse repetition.